In this video, I'll talk about the National Identification and Registration Act, NIRA, which was passed in 2019 to set up the National Registration Authority and the National Identification System, NIDS. The question that arises is why this law was enacted in the first place. The main goal of this law was to set up a National Identification and Registration Authority, NIRA, which would be in charge of NIDS and give the government the right to collect and store personal and biometric information about all Jamaican citizens and residents, such as fingerprints and pictures of their faces. This data would be stored in a national identification database, which would be used to verify people's identities, particularly when carrying out activities such as voting, banking, or receiving government assistance. But the constitutionality of a few parts of this law was questioned in court, and it was decided that some parts went against the Constitution of Jamaica. In particular, Clause 2, 3, gave the NIRA and the responsible minister a lot of power without any checks and balances to stop abuse. Clause 7 said that people had to give sensitive personal information to the NIDS on their own, but there were no guarantees that it would only be used for that purpose. Article 13 said that people had to show their NIDS card to get government help, but it didn't protect vulnerable groups. Article 14 had fines and penalties that were too harsh for people who didn't sign up or gave wrong information. So, in April 2019, the Supreme Court of Jamaica declared that the National Identification and Registration Act, NIRA, infringed several major articles of the Jamaican Constitution, including the rights to privacy, equality before the law, and freedom of movement. The court said that the law was unconstitutional and struck it down. This stopped the NIDS system from being put into place in Jamaica. So what were the legal arguments that the Supreme Court used when it handed down the decision to declare NIDS invalid or in breach of the Constitution of Jamaica? Firstly, the court argued that the National Identification and Registration Act was unconstitutional because it gave too much power to one part of the government without enough rules to make sure they don't misuse or abuse that power. It's like if you give a child all the power to make decisions without any adult supervision, there is a real possibility that they might make some bad choices. Second, collecting biometric information like fingerprints and facial scans was seen as a huge invasion of privacy. The court thought that there weren't enough rules in place to make sure that this information would only be used for what it was meant for. It's like if someone took your photo without asking and used it for something you didn't want them to use it for. This is the kind of power that the government wants when it comes to our personal information. Finally, the court also said that the National Identification and Registration Act did not do enough to help people who were already struggling, like older people, people with disabilities, or people who were poor. This could make it harder for them to get important things like health care or education. The court thought that this wasn't fair and that everyone should have the same chance to get the help they need. So, these are the reasons why the Supreme Court of Jamaica decided that the National Identification and Registration Act was not allowed under the Jamaican Constitution, and so the people who had been fighting against the NIDS system for a long time were very happy about this decision, because it meant that the government couldn't collect and store their personal information without following the rules and protecting their rights. I want to clear up a misunderstanding that some people may have about the NIRA. Even though the Supreme Court declared it unconstitutional in 2019, the government of Jamaica made changes to the bill to address the concerns raised by the court on the constitutionality of certain provisions of the act. And in October 2021, the revised NIRA was passed. Some people might have thought that the Jamaican Supreme Court rejected the NIDS bill and that was the end of it, but that's not entirely true. The government of Jamaica revised the bill to address the concerns raised by the court, and the revised NIRA was passed in October 2021. The new version of the bill makes a number of important changes to protect privacy and stop people from misusing personal information. One of the most important changes is that people now have to give clear permission for their personal information to be collected and used. The bill also limits the purposes for which the data can be used. Also, an independent group called the National Identification and Registration Authority, NIRA, was set up to keep an eye on how the NYD's system is put into place and runs. The National Identification and Registration Authority's job is to make sure that the system follows legal and constitutional standards. These changes were made to address the constitutional concerns raised by the Supreme Court and to ensure that the NIDS system operates in a fair and lawful manner. So, for all those who thought that the Jamaican Supreme Court rejected the NIDS bill, and that was the end of it, you were wrong. This law is an important part of the paradigm shift toward the Fourth Industrial Revolution, which was accelerated in December 2019 and must be finished by 2030 or 2045 at the latest. So there was no way in the world that they wouldn't have found a way to get this law passed. The question now is, what exactly did they do to make NIDS Law after all the opposition it received? The answer is simple. They did what the people wanted because, in the end, it doesn't matter what the law says. Once they have your information, the wheel is set in motion, and there is nothing you can do to stop it. Besides, they can always revise the law later down the road to give them the power to use your information in whatever way they please. So remember that I said that the Jamaican government revised the NIRA bill to address the constitutional concerns raised by the Supreme Court? The question is, what were the revisions made to the NIRA that caused the court to reverse its decision? You may recall that I mentioned that civil rights groups were complaining that people's right to privacy was not fully protected under this law. The new bill makes sure that your personal information will only be collected with your knowledge and permission. If there is a data breach, the government must let you know and take steps to protect your information. You will also have the right to view, correct, and delete your personal data, and the law will punish those who access, use, or disclose your data without authorization. The bill also sets up the National Identification and Registration Authority, NIRA, an independent body that will keep an eye on how the NID system is set up and run and make sure it meets legal and constitutional requirements. But let's talk about consent for a minute. We all know that consent doesn't always mean you know what you are actually agreeing to, and we also know consent can be manufactured. Let me try to break it down for you. When you use an online service like a game or a social media app, like Instagram, for example, you have to agree to a set of rules called the Terms of Service, or TOS. You and the platform are essentially entering into a contract with each other, yet these rules are often very wordy and hard to understand. Now, I don't know about you. I don't read any of these things. I just check the box that says I have read and agreed to the Terms of Service, and that's it. I mean, who has time to sit down and read all of that information? And even if you did, would you even understand what any of it means? And your understanding is necessary if you are to give informed consent. The government knows this. So, under the NIDS system, the likely scenario is that the government will give people consent forms, and this is their way of covering themselves legally. Most people probably won't even read what is on these forms, or if they do read it, they may not understand what exactly it is that they are allowing the government to do, and they may very well end up giving the government permission to use their personal information in ways they don't want. And the government will have bypassed the law and done what the law expressly forbids it to do. All right, so the other revision relates to complaints from civil society and human rights groups with regards to protections for vulnerable groups. The original bill didn't take into account how hard it is for older people and people with disabilities to give biometric information or use government services. The new version of the bill includes exemptions and other options for vulnerable groups. For example, people who are over a certain age or have certain disabilities will be able to show other forms of ID, such as a passport or driver's license. The government must also make sure that all Jamaicans can use NIDs, even those who live in rural areas. They also included a clause that gives people the right to file complaints and seek redress if their rights and freedoms have been violated. This is great and all, except that the government already knows that most of us can't afford lawyers, that the court system is already overwhelmed, that it will likely take several years to have your matter settled in court, and nobody has the time or money to go through all of that. At the moment, human rights are being violated every day in Jamaica without any consequences. We have oversight groups for every industry, but these industries continue to take advantage of consumers. So, having a watchdog group to keep an eye on NIDs doesn't really mean anything. Now that we have that out of the way, let's take a step back and look at the bigger picture. which is the shift toward digital identification not just in Jamaica but all around the world. The plan is to use our fingerprints and facial scans, together with other forms of biometric data, to not only prove that you are who you say you are, but also to keep tabs on you. The government wants to know where you are and what you are doing every minute of every day. This information will be kept in a central database that many organizations and businesses will be able to use. This makes people worry about privacy invasions, government abuse, and the possibility of cyber attacks. So yes, there are definitely concerns about privacy and security with any kind of digital system, but the digital ID system takes it to a whole new level. It's not just about the risk of hackers posting your embarrassing photos online or something like that. It's about the potential for the government to use all this information against us in ways we can't even imagine. But we are not too concerned about hackers and such. What we are terrified of is that the digital ID system is a Trojan horse for government surveillance and control, a digital gulag or prison. The digital ID system is a big threat to privacy and personal freedom. It's rife with potential for abuse because of all the ways it may be manipulated. This system could be used to enslave people without using physical force. To help you understand how dangerous the digital ID system could be, let's make up a scenario. You wake up one morning to find that some of your personal information has been changed without your knowledge or consent, and you have no idea who did it. Due to the fact that the government has access to your biometric data, such as fingerprints and facial scans, the digital ID system makes it possible for this to happen. In the past, if the government wanted to change something about your physical ID, you had to get a new ID by going to a government office, filling out the paperwork, and getting a new ID. Even though going through this process is not particularly convenient, doing so ensures that you are kept informed of any alterations that are made to the data you have. Now let's go back to the situation. The government has changed your information, and now your ID card says you have a criminal record. You are also being accused of crimes you did not commit. You wouldn't find out that they changed your personal information until you went somewhere and the staff asked you for your ID. At this point, they call the police on you and have you arrested. At first, you're confused and maybe frightened. But this is a very real possibility, especially for people like us who are speaking out against the government. Since the government put the information there, and we already know that people will believe anything the government says, even if you tried to clear your name, nobody would believe you. The evidence will show that you were at the scene of the crime, and the digital ID system confirms it. With advances in artificial intelligence that can place you anywhere at any time. When the time comes, the evidence will show that you committed the crime, even though in reality you were nowhere near the place where the crime was committed. You end up in jail, fighting for your freedom while your reputation is ruined and people start to see you differently. The legal process can be long and hard, and even if you're found not guilty, some people might still think you're guilty. This is the frightening potential of the digital ID system, and I have no doubt that they will use it for the same purpose that I described. But I am aware that you may think that what I am saying is crazy talk or alarmist behavior. The government can make up evidence against anyone it wants, shut down anyone's voice if it thinks it's necessary, and even kill anyone who threatens its power and authority. Remember, with digital IDs, they will know where you are at all times because your geolocation will be tracked and traced in real time. And if the government knows where you are every single moment of every single day, then it is easy for them to take you out and make it look like an accident or a robbery gone bad or whatever method they deem appropriate. And this is just the tip of the iceberg because, as we already know, there are fates far worse than death. I cannot stress enough how vitally important it is for us to pay attention to what our government is doing now more than ever. Our concerns about this digital ID system are not far-fetched. They are real, and these are the intended purposes of this new digital surveillance system. It has nothing to do with the fanciful conveniences that they talk about, which is why I never looked into the benefits of the digital ID system. The government or corporations do not care about your convenience. They absolutely do not. We have to be hyper-vigilant. We have to pay attention. We have to wake up to the reality that our government is working against us and has joined forces with unknown powers to kill and enslave people. Although the future is uncertain and we are in danger, I am certain that if we don't take action, some of us will perish, and the rest will become slaves on a planet where sociopaths and tyrants rule. Thank you for watching. Stay safe and keep informed.